Welcome to the third video in this series. Before we jump into the text, let's do just a little bit of review. One thing I'd like you to keep in mind throughout this brief study is the theme of the inversion of God's creative order. If I had to describe a genre of the type of sin that we see from the fall in Genesis 3 through Genesis 11 here, that would be it. People are rebelling against God's creative order. One example, of course, here in Genesis 3 would be verse 5, "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And so the reason that the tempter gives the woman to partake of the fruit is that you'll have knowledge like God. Well, in what sense like God? Like God in that you will have divine knowledge, supernatural knowledge, knowledge that is not given to you based on your place in the creative order. We find the reversal of God's creative order in the flood account also, especially when you keep in mind that in the ancient Near East, waters were symbols of chaos, things that opposed creative order, and so chaos reigns once again. And then the flood is over, God separates the waters once again, and there's a new creation. So you have this theme in Genesis of people rebelling against God's creative order, the inversion of God's creative order, and then the reestablishing of that order. Okay, so that's very important. So keep that in mind as we jump into Genesis chapter 11. "And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." And so the context here, which is pretty much universally recognized, is the building of a ziggurat. Okay, and a ziggurat in the ancient Near East, there was symbiosis between the people and the gods and the people. They would both do things for each other. The gods weren't nearly as autonomous as we think of today. And so ziggurats were a place where people would summon the gods. You come down here when I call you, and when you descend, you will descend right here where we're building this ziggurat. Now, the people are going to find out that you don't treat Yahweh like that. Yahweh is not summoned like any other deity in the ancient Near East. But that's the context, and this verse provides a little bit of a theological trouble, at least on the surface. Highlighted in yellow, "And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." Now, this is, of course, a motif that we would attribute to God. God's plans cannot be made impossible, but people's plans surely can be made impossible. Now, the Continental Commentary series provides some illumination here. The same two verbs, the same roots, occur in Job 42:2. As in Genesis 11:6b, zamam and batzar. When one adds that zamam is a rare word and batzar is very rare, then it looks as if there is a fixed formula behind these two verses. It would be a formula of the praise of God. Nothing that you will is impossible to you. Okay, and so this is just a brief but very dense explanation. We're going to unpack it a bit. What happens here is that these two rare verbs, batzar and zamam, occur again in Job 42, as the commentators say. And given the fact that they're very rare and they occur in very close proximity to each other in these two passages, well, this is what leads them to say that it's possibly a fixed formula or a stylistic formula of praise to God. Now, in Job 42:2, let's just go to that real quickly. "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted." Now, this is something that's much more theologically acceptable, but when you keep in mind the type of sin that's being committed in Genesis 3 through 11, the inversion of the creative order, people trying to claim divine qualities of God for themselves, well, then this reading makes perfect sense. Let's use some imagination. So you're an ancient Israelite sitting around the fire, perhaps listening to some traditions being recited from Genesis chapter 11, and you get to the person reciting this tradition gets to Genesis 11:6b, "And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for," and your mind wants to fill in God. We all know God's plans can't be made impossible. Anything that God wills, He can do. Yet, that's not what you hear. Instead, you hear, "Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." And then red flags go off in your mind, because you realize that this hymn of praise to God, if you want to think about it like that, has just been applied to people. And you realize it's happening again. People are rebelling against the creative order. They're taking something that's God's and claiming it for themselves. In their collective effort to build this ziggurat so that they can call down God when they want Him and where they want Him, they're thinking like only God should think. Nobody can thwart our plans. We will do what we want. And that's not how it works. Now, here's something very interesting, because there isn't just this connection between Genesis chapter 11 and Job 42 with these two rare verbs occurring close to each other and the plans of God and the plans of people. There's actually more of a connection. And the connection is that God has just finished describing himself to Job as the awesome creator. God is all-powerful. And Job acknowledges this. He says in Job 42:2, I know that you can do all things. So Job acknowledges God's sovereignty. Yet something very interesting happens. God is dealing with Job's friends. And he says to Eliphaz, my anger burns against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right as my servant Job has. And then he says, basically, Job will act as a priest, and then God says, if you do such and such, he says, for I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly. So God is all-powerful, but he doesn't deal with them according to their folly. Very interesting, because a really good biblical backdrop against which to consider this is where we started in Genesis 11, because we find God not dealing with people according to their folly. Now, what I mean by this is that we should fully expect to read about a second flood. All of the antecedent conditions for the first flood are in place for the second flood. People are just as wicked as they were before. They're engaged in collective rebellion against God's creative order. Once again, the same thing is happening over and over again. People are so stubborn. Where's the second flood? Well, it doesn't happen because God made a covenant with Noah. You're desperately wicked from your youth, but here's what I'll do. I'm not going to deal with you according to your sin. And so you begin with this fun little academic exercise of chasing down these two rare verbs, and it helps you illuminate from Job 42 how to read and how to understand Genesis 11. We have, once again, people trying to step on God's turf, people trying to claim that which is God's for themselves, people not happy with where they are in God's creative order. But that's not all. We also find the common theme in Job 42 and Genesis 11, that God is the all-powerful, sovereign creator, yet, out of his mercy, in spite of man's wickedness, desperately wicked from his youth, in spite of that, God does not deal with us according to what we deserve. Sounds very much like a passage we mentioned briefly in Psalm 103 on the previous video. God does not deal with us according to our iniquity. What a fun and interesting exercise to chase these words through the Hebrew text and see how they help illuminate our reading, and more importantly, and most importantly, help illuminate our conception of God and where we stand before God. Guilty. We're guilty. But God, out of his mercy, doesn't deal with us according to our sin. Thanks for watching.